Howard, thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me here to have this conversation.
Absolute pleasure, absolute pleasure. So, before we get started, I want to understand a little bit more about you and your work. So, in the introduction, we heard that you hold the Lego Chair Professorship at IMD. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at IMD?
Yeah, so I joined IMD almost 9 years ago, and historically, I focus on pretty much on disruptive technology when I was still at Harvard Business School. And ever since I joined IMD, you kind of expand your portfolio a little bit, and these days are really focusing on future readiness. What we're trying to unpack at IMD with the research center that I lead is to really measure and rank why some companies are much more future ready than others. And during the pandemic, we see the huge difference in terms of performance. Those who are future ready, they are much more resilient than others. So in a way that thanks to the generosity from the Lego group, we are able to channel the endowment into this research endeavor. And hopefully we'll be able to contribute to the practice of management field.
That's fantastic. Surely that's one of the most vital things in anything to be future ready, isn't it? It must be a very much in demand area.
Because what we see is, before the pandemic, people have been talking about digitization for 5, 6, 7 years ago, and before that, it was like whether it's we talk a little bit about e-commerce on the side or digitization a little bit, and now today, what you see in the pandemic is everything is almost putting on a turbocharge, and if you're not ready, you don't have those deep capability, then we are suffering. Same thing for flexi work, right? It wasn't during the pandemic. All of a sudden, we're talking about remote first and things like that. Companies talk about flexible working arrangement for a long, long time. And now, again, the pandemic becomes the stress test to test out which company have the capability to convert on a rapid form. And so you see Spotify going to remote first, even Amazon talking about 2 days on flexi work at home. And those who couldn't convert because of historic legacy and cultural barrier and complexity of work, they see they have a harder time to attract a pool of talent. And of course, today, to become future ready, we've got to think beyond just bottom line. It's about sustainability, it's about diversity, inclusiveness. But the whole idea of carbon footprint, we see it really forces companies to fundamentally challenge their own business model and reason to exist.
Wonderful. And actually, you've covered so much in that answer already, and I'd like to come back to it. So you've said the pandemic has had an impact, and we've observed speeding up, really. You mentioned e-commerce, you mentioned flexi working, you've mentioned other areas too. What else has been accelerated, or have you covered the main areas?
Well, those are, I would tend to think about technologically related, whether it's flexi work, company leverage on technology. Of course, e-commerce is technology driven, and a lot of the carbon footprint containment is really require technology as well. To become future ready, I think among executives these days, we also need to branch out a little bit to become much more hyper aware around geopolitics as well. The whole tension between US and China is not going to go away during the Biden administration. So as companies having global footprint, even if you're based in Europe, for instance, if your product sales is internationally, then it has implication. How do you position yourself? How do we leverage the market development that continue to diverge between the two systems so that you could really capitalize the maximum opportunity out there, as well as buffer yourself against the worst?
Absolutely, definitely. So vital, vital, vital. So you suggesting that we've got implications for our business models, and that there's going
Mm.
to be new operating models post. I'm going to say post COVID, but probably it's already starting now, is it?
Yes, absolutely. And this is where I always nudge our executive at IMD to really think beyond just peer group benchmarking, right? If you are a specialized equipment provider, it's so easy that we suffer a blind spot and we keep on benchmarking your peer group. But what we see more recently, especially organizations that are future ready, they almost would borrow an industry logic from others so that they can stay ahead of the curve. For instance, right, the most future-ready financial companies, they don't behave, and can see it in data, they don't behave like the average bank. They actually behave much more like an IT company. And we measure across different firm behavior, right? Even exploitation versus exploration. Are you biased for action? Are you optimistic? Or are you much more of a threat driven? It's again and again, we see this peculiar pattern of behavior. Companies that are future ready, they go beyond their own sector logic. And I think it has huge implication about how we train and onboard our executive. How do we expand our aperture a little bit going forward? So yeah, I mean, we see every aspect is changing.
And actually, I want to refer to a story that I heard you tell because I just thought it was so funny, and it does relate to this and the fact that you're talking about people being future ready and organizations being future ready. But you were telling a story about beggars in China being very future ready. Could you share that story? Because it made me laugh out loud when I heard it.
I mean, in the West, we kind of take, mobile payment and, mobile app is sort of hip, right? At the moment that you don't no longer need to step in your brand, just like, it's a godsend. But then, of course, digital payment has been ubiquitous in China. And this is one of these instances, right? If you're a financial company, you want to look in the East to source good idea, and then you can scale in your own home market. So I remember I was, taking a group of German engineers touring around China. And at night, I kind of take a night stroll at the People's Park in the city of Shanghai. So there are homeless people asking for donation. The only thing is they actually don't ask for change. They don't want cash. They hold up a QR code and ask for mobile payment using the mobile app. So you think about that, the beggar in China gone digital. So if we are leader in leading digital transformation, we need to look out from our own comfort zone to source new idea.
I think it's genius that the beggars have gone digital because actually I was out in the UK here. We have a magazine that the homeless people sell to make money, and I'm thinking why don't carry any cash anymore because we've all during Corona we've all been using cards, and I actually said to her, how can I pay you? So they need to go digital. They need to learn from the Chinese who are leading the way. That's absolutely. I love that story. It's fantastic. And actually I want to digress. I know we prepared some questions. I want to digress a little bit because the other thing I found fascinating is that you were sharing that there were sort of four different types of organization business models, and that the value that we used to put on a business has changed dramatically over the last 10-15 years, that the asset-based companies now may not be the ones that were. Can you share what those four models were, because I'd never
Right.
understood those so clearly until I heard you.
I mean, it also a reflection of some of the long-term trend getting accelerated during the pandemic as well. But if you think about today, of course, in terms of valuation of an organization, if you're platform or if you're asset light, you are being valued with a much higher price to booking ratio. So simply, the valuation of your company, holding the earning per share constant, somehow platform just shoot off the roof. And if you're looking at last 20-30 years, in fact, that systemic trend has been happening gradually and then suddenly. So 30 years ago, if you are an asset builder, meaning you control a iron ore or an oil field, or you have tons of equipment in your factory, you're king. And physical asset really counts majority of the value of a company. Today, what you see is intangible asset becomes much more important. So things like brand, your IP, your know-how, the data, the algo that we build, the intangible becomes much more important. The implication becomes in every single industry, there are four types of companies or business model, if you will, compete on the whole arena. So there are asset builders, right? So company, when they expand, they need to build up physical assets. So a manufacturing-based company or a shipping line, for instance, right? A shipping line, when they expand the trade route, you build a container ship. So these are asset builders. Second type is professional service firm, like a legal firm, a consultancy, like business school like us, right? The
Yeah.
moment we expand to Singapore, for instance, from Lausanne to Singapore, the first thing we do, we have to hire faculty. We need foot soldier on the ground to start teaching. That's the second type. And the third one is sort of technology provider. Think about Intel and IBM provide technology for other sector to use. And the last one is essentially this idea of a platform. These are asset light that link supply and demand together. So Didi, the Uber of China, is now going through IPO today. They're commanding 67 billion valuation, much larger than Honda, much larger than GM and all these guys. It's like you kind of wonder, how did that happen? And in a way, it's exactly what they represent is asset light, data heavy, and they really link supply and demand on both sides in orchestrating the ecosystem. Now, of course, the pandemic, we could say all the online food delivery company and all the ride sharing company are taking off. But again, it's this gradually and then suddenly movement occurred.
I mean, that's fascinating. That when I first heard you talk about the platform, and you're absolutely right, where in fact the platform owns nothing and it's literally just matching the supply to the demand. I think it's very clever. Do you think that this will have implications for other organizations, for organizational setup? Do we need to rethink our organizations?
Absolutely, right? So it's never about whether your product is good or not. It's really about whether you could differentiate your offering and in order to capture value. So what we're seeing the challenge for a lot of traditional company, and our role is to really help executive to see how they can build up capability so that in the future, they can continue to capture value that they created along the value chain. If we only focusing on the product offering, particularly if it's only about a physical product, as we already saw, the ability to capture value would get diminished because data becomes more important. The AI behind becomes more important. If we don't get access to end user information or data, it becomes harder for us to integrate the innovation pipeline. And if we couldn't do it as fast as some of these digital native players along your ecosystem, then value get leaked out to those players. We see that in the hospitality industry, right?
Yeah.
It's booking.com, it's this Priceline guys that value leaks away from hotel and airline to this person, to these players, these new entrants. So whether you are in the pharmaceutical space, in healthcare, device organization, or electric companies, we've got to think about these notions so that you can blend in both digital as well as your hard offering together. And that is the secret to achieve longevity.
So the secret is to have both. It's not either or, you have to have both together. Okay.
Yeah.
What about individual behaviors? What about leaders? Do they need to take on new skills to be able to achieve that, would you say?
Yeah. So these days, of course, I find the most effective executives are intensely curious, right? They are just having this need cognitively to get satisfied. Bill Gates famously would read a book a week, and Warren Buffett, when he was young, he would read 500 pages of document. And they all say like knowledge works like compound interest. The more you know about a new domain, the more interest that you have. And psychologists have explained there's a curiosity gap that in order for you to be interested in something, you kind of need the baseline knowledge. And I'm not suggesting everyone needs to read like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, but coincidentally, the former CEO from PepsiCo, she would also read textbook cover to cover during a holiday. I would read a novel on a beach on my holiday, right? She would read textbook on something that she had mastered as a hard skill. So you can think about that. The most effective executive, they are curious, they're able to build hard skill relatively fast. So, if you are in the IT, you might learn about programming in the past is hardwire, classic software programming. Today is AI. And I know chairman of Beggars PC manufacturer, he would spend weekend and evening just to learn about this new approach of coding. So I thought this is a really interesting way of thinking about. It's no longer just T talent that you're deep in one and broad in others, but it's more like an and, right? You develop additional deep skill really down, or even an M eventually.
Wow, I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting. Actually, I take business books on holiday. So not that I've had a holiday for the last year and a half, but I tend to do that. So maybe I could have been Bill Gates. Who knows? Anyway, so that's very interesting. The N, the T, the M. That really is fascinating. So clearly, you can help executives accelerate their learning as well because you can help them on the executive programs at IMD, but also you're available for hire, aren't you, as a speaker? What areas are you working with executives and leaders and organizations when you are brought in to speak?
There are two objectives usually companies trying to achieve. One is to get inspired so that there is this inner need and momentum to take their own initiative forward. So that's the individual impact. But more and more what happens is within an organization, what they want is to arrive at a shared viewpoint, to legitimize a conversation. Normally in their board meeting or in their management review meeting doesn't occur. And this is where I think the intervention would drive most value. So if you're thinking about every company talk about sustainability, but honestly, if you're going inside the organization, there are not a lot of organizations have really put purpose to the core of the strategy. And if you unpack any business review meeting, what gets trapped is continually to be a conversation based on historic KPI, whether it's profit growth or revenue growth. And, the whole big idea outside continues to stay on the fringe. It doesn't move to the core. And what we want to achieve, what clients usually want to achieve is an unconventional dialogue, right? Based on outside in perspective. And then with very tangible and surgical, laser focused type of discussion and group work that you legitimize topics that usually be a taboo. And then systematically thinking about the what if scenario. Okay, we don't believe the world is going to go, for example, totally electric vehicle by 2035. That's okay. But what about 2040? What about 2050? And what is the percentage of each of these scenarios, the money that you're willing to bet? Or at a sudden, it opens up a conversation, it's no longer yes or no, but it's a range of possibility with the implication of our investment. In fact, the world will be that stage in 10 years, but the preparation you actually need to start now. That means that any managers and leaders, they need to change the way they behave right away now as a group. And that's the power, I think, when we conduct intervention for company, is to legitimize those unconventional dialogue and with real action taking away, real trade-off, real allocation of resources result. And that drives, in fact, my own satisfaction too.
I can imagine. I can also see that you give them a bit of clarity as to the direction that they're going, and you're helping them to see the future and be ready for it in many ways. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's also trying to, a lot of the knowledge is inside a room. Someone would have seen it. Someone would have known it. It actually collectively, the rooms, the audience will be smarter than me myself. But I guess as a orchestrator, my role is to really help bring the best of the room to show them, well, in fact, this is not just some crazy idea out there. You have recognized that, and you've seen what is working and what's not. And then the idea build on one another. We help them to get unstuck in the conversation, and we try to help them move in the trajectory that they know they should explore.
So you really facilitate, the strategic thinking and move them forward. You mentioned something about knowledge being inside a room, and I want to refer back to another story that I heard you tell, which I was absolutely fascinating. It was a strange time. You spent 6 months locked in a cellar, didn't you, going through papers. And if you would share that story, because that proved that a particular organization that really, had some difficulties, shall we say, knew what was going to happen. Can you share the story about your research?
Yeah, so that was all the way back in the Harvard days that I was perplexed by this idea, like, disruptive innovation and how come so many companies can see what is coming and yet they just couldn't make it happen. So today, right in front of our eyes, everyone is looking, which car company couldn't make that EV and connected car transition? Sooner or later, everyone is going to looking at all the oil major and energy company, whether they can make the transition into renewable. When I was still, that must be 15 years ago almost. I was still in Boston. I was researching Polaroid. What happened to Polaroid?
Yeah.
Why it's gone out of business? So I was thinking it must be arrogance. They were blind to change and so on. So I spent exactly 6 months down in the archive in the library in Boston, and it was dark, windowless. I was by myself. No one looked at me. It was the saddest time in my dissertation time. And what I find out actually surprises me so much, because back in 1987, the company demonstrated its ability to take a picture digitally, transfer to computer for post-shoot editing in front of their shareholders in the annual meeting, and then transfer to a laser printer to print it out. All the way back in 1987, they have digital camera technology, but they just choose not to commercialize it. It turns out it's the board debate that they couldn't arrive a shared viewpoint. This is why the type of intervention I mentioned earlier are so critical. The marketeers and the researcher knows they need a new channel because they couldn't sell the high-end digital camera at supermarket and grocery store where films are sold. But then you have key account manager and the CFO thinks that, well, if we go into a high-end store and we bypass our middleman, meaning Walmart and Walgreens, we would enrage them. These are big clients. We couldn't afford to do so. And so the CEO were on the fence. And rather than bringing the whole team and have a heat debate to get the truth out, he opts for siding with the powerful coalition. Of course, it's the key account manager and the CFO, right? And then the rest is history. So it underscores two things. I think these days there are so much history that we can learn from. And from that history, it gives us an inspiration. But what is still needed is using these examples to instill a rigorous debate so that as a team, the top management team can really emerge with a shared viewpoint. And then for employees, individual, we have to understand the why, because we are not just taking order from top down. When we translate the strategic direction into action, that translation requires so much, not just the know-how, but the know-why. And I think those conversations are critical.
Not just the know-how, the know-why. I like that. And that is, I was fascinated that, the fact was they knew the answers, but they couldn't make that move. And I suppose that is a danger for many companies, that they can't see it. They need somebody from the outside who can put an objective light onto it and show them. Are there companies these days who are constantly experimenting and trying different things and almost trying to break their own businesses so that they can disrupt themselves rather than be disrupted? Are there any companies doing that?
Yeah, there are many. In fact, the good news is there are many companies who are capable of doing it, all the way to, let's say, energy sector, right? We tended to think energy sector are slow moving, this oil major, they are not imaginative, and they really don't have the true heart into renewable. But there are companies who have gone through that phase. A good example would be a Norwegian-based oil refinery called Nest Oil, right? They are traditional oil refinery. Today is all about renewable jet fuel based on used cooked oil. Can you believe that? They collect cooked oil and turn them into jet fuel, and in terms of the production process, they make sure it's the lowest carbon footprint ever possible by technology, and overall it is transformational. And you have mining company like Umicore really going into the whole circular economy. All of these does represent two things. They need to basically incorporate into a new set of knowledge discipline. So we talk about digital is like whatever you're good at, you add on digital. In this space, it's adding on critical capability around renewable, etc., alongside with digital. But they also need to go through two distinct phases. The first phase is doing a lot of small bet experimentation, trying new things, expand the horizon. This is where you want agility, experimentation, style methodologies. In fact, we have the whole toolkit to support executive do that, because these are reversible decision, right? If something doesn't work out, you can back it out. But in order to make a real impact, at some point, you kind of need to scale. And this requires organizational commitment. So it's moving away from just like exploration to exploitation of new opportunity, new knowledge, and new know-how. So there's always a flip from early experimentation into commitment that have trickled down to resource allocation, tough trade-off, difficult choices. And this is where that honest dialogue becomes very, very critical.
Yeah, it does. It really underpins everything you do, that honest dialogue and sort of looking through at things through a different lens. Really interesting. You wrote a book called Leap: How to Thrive in a World Where Everything Can Be Copied, which is a scary thought that everything can be copied. Tell us a little bit about that book and what people will learn in reading it.
And it does, right? Because what you see is, IP would expire, like our Nespresso capsule, their patent expire, and you see copycat everywhere. Pharmaceutical drugs would turn one day patent off, and so Lipitor by Pfizer expire, and the revenue drop by more than 80%, right? Generic drugs come in. Even if you have secret sauce, you can hire people from competitor and learn. Tesla learn about how to build cars, also by hiring people from the car industry. So the notion is you have something that you can hold on to yourself and people cannot just replicate. It's belonging to the pre-internet era. So that's number one. And second is just because you're clinging onto your historic knowledge, even when it's secretive, at some point, the value capture becomes very, very tough because the environment changed, right? The Swiss watch industry is facing a seismic shift right now, not because of another country is building better watch, but because Apple Watch is coming in. And the wearable that you just show, apparently the revenue of just wearable by Apple is larger than the entire Swiss watchmaking industry.
Wow.
And Apple do co-brand with Hermes and all these guys, right? So, okay, how many watches one can buy, right? In the end, we just have two wrists. And so it's this notion that if we don't build up a new capability and blend that in, at some point, the ability to capture value becomes harder and harder. So that's the main thesis in the past. When I was writing that book, I was really just thinking about, oh, how can I avoid copycat competition? It turns out the model that we just described and discussed, that you need to leap from the old knowledge to the new, first by experimentation and then scale, the model that I articulate in the book, turns out is really about how you become future ready.
Yeah.
Car company are moving away from mechanical engineering, internal combustion engine, to EV vehicle, self-driving car capability based on software algo, and then connectivity. Traditional bank, building branches with human advisor, giving you advices, to AI, robo advisory, mobile app, and mobile payment. I could go on forever, but you see the industry shift is always the same. And if there's one thing that I learned clearly is because the pandemic really accelerated a bunch of stuff, that pattern becomes so obvious in our data set.
Wowzers. Okay, so it all comes back to being future ready. Everything comes back to future ready. Listen, I could talk to you all day, Howard. We've come to the end. So I want to ask you, because you're a very excited and enthusiastic man, what excites you the most these days?
I think it's always exciting to see how a seemingly small idea getting planned in and it flourish in an organization and sustain momentum. And I had this actual observation when we brought a company going to China just to inspire about the idea of rapid innovation. And then that small backdrop of information implanted with the group turns out to be a huge idea that they change the way they organize their R&D activities across the enterprise. And I'm like, this is what drives what we do, I think. Writing help us to clarify. Our executive classroom is our laboratory. And the reward and the fruition is to see our method actually can create an impact in organization in changing both trajectory as well as the way they work. And I guess it's a privilege to see things like this happen.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. Howard, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I just need to thank our listeners for listening to the Speaker Show. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating on iTunes. You can keep up with future episodes on Speakers Associate website, which is speakersassociates.com, or on iTunes, Google Podcast, or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to get a copy of Howard's book, Leap: How to Thrive in a World Where Everything Can Be Copied. See you next week. Thank you and bye-bye.